The Roman Emperor Trajan was fueled by a desire to reproduce the exploits of Alexander the Great. Near the end of his reign, he embarked on a relentless campaign of conquest, pushing Roman borders eastward further than ever before. In Trajan's way was the mighty Parthian Empire, and Rome and Parthia would clash for the entirety of the Pax Romana. The two powers were often engaged in a complex geo-political chess match, much of which focused on the regional power of Armenia. That country often had divided loyalties, and its unfortunate situation of being caught between two warring empires was often disastrous. As we'll see today, Trajan ends up taking Armenia, but was he able to conquer Parthia? We'll talk about that on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 35, Parthia, Rome's Eastern Nemesis. Before we begin, I'd like to let you know that I've been on a few podcasts recently that you might want to check out. I was interviewed on the New Books Network. I was also recently on the Historically Thinking podcast, so check that out. And then finally, if for some reason you haven't done this yet, please pick up my new book, Pax Romana, P-O-X. Pax Romana, the plague that shook the Roman world. That book covers the end of the Pax Romana and the Antonine Plague, the world's first pandemic, and its effects on the Roman Empire. So I hope you enjoy checking out those podcasts and picking up the book. But for now, let's get into today's episode. The Parthian Empire ruled Mesopotamia, Persia, and much of the Middle East for nearly 5 centuries. The Parthians ripped much of their territory away from the Seleucid Empire, one of several successor kingdoms founded by the companions of Alexander the Great just after he died. The Parthian Empire was therefore a culturally diverse empire. It had a rich heritage pulling from Mediterranean cultures and Middle Eastern societies, and Parthia was of course prosperous as well, controlling both the western edge of the Silk Roads and the Persian Gulf. So Parthian traders trucked everything from wine from Roman Gaul to silks all the way from China. Now, by the 1st century AD, Parthia struggled to expand any further west. Rome's growing empire secured control over Asia Minor and Syria and Egypt, and during the Pax Romana, the Parthians never made serious attempts to take territory away from Rome. However, the land just south of the Caucasus Mountains, between the Black Sea on the west and the Caspian Sea on the east, soon became the common battleground where the two great empires, Rome in the west and Parthia in the east, resolved many of their military conflicts. This territory was Armenia. It was once a regional empire, but Armenia had been slowly absorbed during the Pax Romana by both the Romans and the Parthians. By the reign of Rome's first emperor, Augustus, Armenia's role in ancient geopolitics was pretty well defined. It would serve as a buffer state between Rome and Parthia. For decades, the Romans and the Parthians intervened in Armenian politics, setting up client kings, fomenting rebellions, and occasionally sending an army or two into Armenia to fight in open conflicts. There were several important clashes between Rome and Parthia during the Pax Romana. I'd like to focus on 2, one under Nero and then another under Trajan. There's a third really important encounter, but we'll talk about that on a later episode. So first, the reign of Nero. The AD 60s saw a significant shift in the relationship between Rome and Parthia. Nero, however, was not actually the person that instigated this change. As we know from episodes 19 and 20, Nero did not personally lead his own armies. He was too busy living a debauched life back in Rome. Instead, Nero's general, Corbulo, guarded Rome's eastern boundaries, Corbulo was an incredible strategist and a Roman patriot. He loved his country. He knew it was a matter of time before the shaky peace with Parthia would be broken yet again, especially since the current king on the Armenian throne was the younger brother to the Parthian king. So he had obvious loyalties. When Corbulo arrived in the east in the mid-50s AD, he began drilling the 3 legions that he was given. This is about 15,000 soldiers. He built up fortifications and forced his army to endure harsh conditions and enacted strict discipline. The Parthians, noticing that Rome had sent 3 legions to their western border, began flexing their military muscles too, and eventually both powers stumbled into an open conflict in Armenia. Unfortunately for the Parthians, a revolt in one of their other provinces suddenly demanded the attention of the king and his armies. So Armenia was left alone to face Corbulo's army. Even worse, the population of Armenia, as is often the case with buffer states throughout history, had conflicting loyalties. Some of the people were loyal to Rome, others were loyal to Parthia. And so the general Corbulo found himself not only able to attack Armenia without much resistance, but some, even within the country, supported him. And so by AD 60, Corbulo successfully installed a new king in Armenia, one friendly to Roman interests. And then Corbulo purged the Armenian governors of any who were pro-Parthian. But the Parthian king eventually quelled the revolt back in Parthia. He was pretty good at that. And so then he could redirect his resources to taking back Parthia from Roman control. The Parthians, however, were just marginally successful. Corbulo was a pretty good general, and the Parthian armies had come over in haste. They weren't adequately provisioned for any lengthy sieges to retake Armenian cities. Worse, there was a locust plague in the area. The bugs were so numerous that it became difficult for the Parthian army to live off the land, and so in the end, they asked for a peace, and the conditions for the Romans were pretty good. Essentially, there would be a return to the status quo. The Romans and Parthians would both leave, but the old king would be returned provided that he was loyal to the Romans. And so in an act of symbolic submission, the Armenian king, the brother of the Parthian king, threw his crown on the ground in front of a statue of Nero and then declared that he would only pick it back up if it were offered to him by the hand of the Roman emperor himself. So one of the coolest road trips in history took place. The Armenian king trekked all the way over to the imperial capital in Rome, Nero's Rome, and the Romans actually paid for the trip. Now, in order to go into the presence of the emperor, the king was required to remove his sword, but the king wouldn't do it. And so a compromise was reached here too. Nero agreed to let the king keep his sword, provided that he wedged it shut so that it couldn't be removed from its sheath. Nero performed his part in the ceremony. He placed the crown upon the Armenian king's head and then invited him to sit on a throne just next to him, a little bit lower than the Emperor Nero. Nero then made a huge deal, closing the gates of the Temple of Janus, and by doing so, he was announcing that Rome was now universally at peace. The doors of that temple were almost never closed. They had been closed under Augustus. They had also been closed at the end of the Second Punic War. So Nero was trying to say that this was a monumental peace that he had won. Of course, it was really the general Corbulo, not the Emperor Nero, who was responsible for securing the peace with Parthia. But Corbulo was not rewarded well. As Nero descended into paranoia in the mid-60s AD, the emperor grew suspicious of such a successful and popular general, and he became worried that Corbulo might usurp him. So when the Judean revolt broke out in AD 66, and by the way, we covered that on episode 24, Nero appointed Vespasian as commander of the Roman forces and not Corbulo. Corbulo instead was summoned to meet Nero while the emperor was on one of his singing tours in Greece. Corbulo was loyal, and he did what he was told to do, but the summons were a little bit suspicious because not only had Nero invited the general, but also his two surviving brothers, both of whom were serving as governors in the German provinces. So the three men came from opposite ends of the empire and reunited in Greece. But Nero, rather than meet Corbulo, just sent him a simple message. For the good of the empire, Corbulo was ordered to commit suicide. And that's what he did. The general spoke his final words, "I am worthy." And then he fell on his sword and died. Corbulo didn't survive to see it, but the peace that he secured would last for decades, all the way until the reign of Trajan. And it would have lasted for longer, but Trajan provoked the Parthians into war. Now, the Romans would claim that it was the Parthians that were responsible for the new hostilities. I'm not so sure. The Parthians continued to do what they had agreed to do under Nero. That is, they put kings on the Armenian throne, but they always consulted with the Roman government and got the emperor's approval. But when the Parthians installed a new king in AD 133 while Trajan was emperor, he claimed that he was not duly consulted. I think Trajan was really just looking for an excuse to go to war. And I made the case in episode 31 that Trajan seemingly thought himself a living god. He also had a growing obsession with Alexander the Great and wished to replicate Alexander's eastern conquest. The Parthians offered Trajan the right to appoint a different king if it would just mollify them. But Trajan refused even this very generous gesture. I don't think he really wanted peace. So then Trajan himself led the charge into Armenia around AD 113. And this campaign was a total pummeling. We don't know how many troops Trajan took with him, but the Armenian king was overwhelmed and he quickly surrendered. The Romans, however, decided to go ahead and just murder him because instead of a client kingdom, Trajan wanted Armenia as a Roman province. And so the next year, in AD 114, the province of Armenia was born, and Roman territory shifted further east than it had ever been. But Trajan was just getting started. His soldiers surged down into the Fertile Crescent, down the Euphrates River, and deep into Persian territory. The Persians put up very little resistance. Their heavily armored and mobile cavalry continued to give way to the Roman infantry, biding their time. So it looked like Trajan was very successful, and for this rapid invasion, he was hailed by the Roman Senate as the conqueror of Armenia and the two great Mesopotamian rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris. And the emperor's soldiers in Syria erected a triumphal arch to Trajan's apparent conquests. By AD 116, Trajan had taken most of the major cities west of the Persian Gulf, and he had created another province, this one called Mesopotamia. But rather than begin the work of consolidating his rule and these two newly won provinces, Trajan decided to press on to the city of Susa, the seat of the Parthian king, and he got it. And he deposed the Parthian ruler in the process. So at this point, it seemed like the war with Parthia was in the bag. Trajan had successfully replicated the first stage of Alexander the Great's conquest some 4.5 centuries earlier. But Trajan was in his 60s, while Alexander was half his age when he had set out on his eastern adventures. Trajan, according to the Roman senator Cassius Dio, realized that he was not going to go much beyond Mesopotamia, certainly not all the way into India, as Alexander had done. But Trajan had other problems. As the Parthians knew all too well, it was tremendously difficult to control so much landlocked territory. And the Romans almost immediately struggled to control both all of their existing territory and the newly won territory in Persia. Emergencies started to stack up. An earthquake destroyed the city of Antioch in Syria, a major capital and staging ground for Eastern wars. And then perplexingly, thousands of Jewish people, now spread over numerous parts of the Roman Empire, inexplicably revolted, seemingly in coordination. Roman cities in North Africa, Egypt, and Judea were suddenly plunged into chaos and revolt. We know very little details. It appears that there was a messianic figure who led at least part of the revolt or inspired it to start, but it lasted over 2 years and it was violent and hundreds of thousands of people were killed. Eventually, the revolt spread even into the Parthian cities that Trajan had believed to be conquered. Trajan's armies were forced to turn around, to move west and reconquer the same lands and the same cities, and brutally punish the rebellions by sacking and looting Parthian territory yet again. And Trajan's suppression of Jews during this time was so infamous that some Jewish writers, when naming Trajan, add the epitaph, "May his bones be crushed." So with the Eastern campaign suddenly under threat, Trajan had to divide up his legates and send them to all sorts of different regions to quell rebellions, both in Persia, but also even in established Roman territory. Trajan himself stayed in the east, going to Hatra. This is a fortress city in what is now northern Iraq. He put that city under a siege. But during the struggle to take Hatra, Trajan became sick. We don't know what disease he caught, but he was likely exposed to some kind of new pathogens during his time in Mesopotamia. His immune system seemingly couldn't cope. One source even claims that he suffered a stroke and lost control over part of his body. Either way, Trajan's health rapidly weakened, and so he had to abandon his armies and his campaign and set back for Italy. He made it as far as Asia Minor, where he finally died at the age of 63. Trajan's death was a tremendous turning point in the fortunes of the Pax Romana. For one thing, his eastern conquests were undone rapidly. The rebellions in Persia led Trajan's successor to abandon the territory east of Syria, and a peace was negotiated with the Parthians, and they got virtually everything back. Even some of Trajan's other projects within the empire were undone. So his kilometer-long bridge over the Danube was destroyed to prevent incursions. In fact, the Roman Empire would never again be as large as it was for those few years during Trajan's conquests in Persia. In the decades after Trajan, subsequent emperors were forced to adopt defensive strategies, fortifying borders and fighting back invaders. For a time, however, the Pax Romana continued. But Trajan's reign exposed the hard limits on Roman imperialism. Instead of fighting to expand their territory, the Romans now began the long struggle to defend the territory that they could hold. The Pax Romana was not going to end overnight, but as we'll see in the coming episodes, the tide had finally turned.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocor. Follow Dr. Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.